into the presentation of today. And I would like to introduce Dr. Sara Dubois, who is a wildlife biologist. Her area of expertise is wildlife welfare and the human dimension of wildlife control. She has a B.Sc from the University of Victoria and an M.Sc and Ph.D. from the University of British Columbia, where she's an adjunct professor for the UBC Animal Welfare Program. She is the Chief Scientific Officer for the British Columbia Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And she directs province-wide welfare science, operation, education, and advocacy projects. She has worked on issues ranging from wildlife rehabilitation and oil spill responses to captive wild animal management, exotic pets, urban wildlife, conflict, and compassionate conservation. She also assists wildlife cruelty investigation. Sorry, I forgot to tell you that I will butcher all your bio before I start. Normally, I'll do it. I apologize at the beginning because of my really thick accent. I would like to remind you all that today we are here to hear about the internationally agreed upon principle for ethical wildlife control. We are not here to talk about our deep-rooted values, what we believe and what we think ethic is, but we are here to listen. What are the parameters that are currently used when evaluating a project, such as the Sidney Island one? So I please remind you to be mindful of what you ask and how you treat our guests, as she is here on her free will. So let's thank Sara and let's give her the floor.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very jealous. I just heard about all the other presentations that you guys have attended so far. So I feel quite privileged to be invited amongst those other experts and professionals. So I'm going to be sharing my screen in just a moment, but I just wanted to acknowledge I'm coming from you today from the land of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and I am very grateful to them for being guardians of our wildlife, our lands, and our waters. Particularly, I live on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and so that is very relevant to my day-to-day life and their advocacy. So I am here today. Of course, I work for the BC SPCA, and I'm also an adjunct at UBC, but my participation here today is not an endorsement of this project. I just want to disclose that from the beginning. We have been invited to review the final project proposal if it gets to that point. And so the BC SPCA is happy to provide feedback on that proposal. But again, at this point, we have no opinion on the particular project at this time. Of course, there's concerns, and that's why we're talking about ethical control principles today. Because, of course, although we don't have an opinion for or against a project, doesn't mean that we still aren't very concerned, because wildlife management comes with many complex issues that involve welfare. So I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully, can you confirm that you can all see this? Excellent.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, technology is working. That's great. So at this point, you know, I'm going to walk you through some scenarios using the 7 questions that I've had to kind of reconcile, because I'm asked a lot about certain projects in wildlife management, particularly when it comes to conducting wildlife control. And so that could be the wolves of British Columbia. We all know this controversy in BC. And we have been asked as the BC SPCA, as the Animal Welfare Agency in British Columbia, of course, to give opinions on this project. This is very controversial, not only by the methods, but as to why the project is being done. So you can read more about that. You can get in touch with me at some point if you're interested in this particular project. But it really made us consider like all the other concerns about managing wildlife and how we control them, and are there situations where we can do it properly, as like when would we be okay with managing wildlife in this way? And so I just wanted to touch on our definition of wildlife control, and that is the intentional, lethal, and or non-lethal actions that aim to restrict an animal's activity. So this could include killing the animal, but it could also mean we relocate the animal to a short distance, or we translocate the animal to a far distance, or we decide we just want to exclude the animal from an area. That is controlling its activity. And so broadly, wildlife control can fall under conservation as a goal, or it can fall under wildlife management as a separate goal, or it can even fall under like wildlife disease. So when we manage animals because of a disease outbreak and risk to the rest of the population. So control is used in a variety of different types of activities. We can even use it in our own homes. So we use pest control to exclude animals from coming into our properties, and some people manage that with other lethal means as well. So it's a very broad term. But when it comes to control, a lot of people focus on the how. How is it actually done? You know, is it quick? Is it humane? Is it done, you know, with the least amount of suffering? But actually, what is a more complex question and the harder question to answer is, why are we actually trying to control animals? The how is actually something that we can measure. So when it comes to animal welfare, it's a science because we can measure humaneness and give, you know, an answer as to whether or not some type of technique is humane. So the how can be answered, whether you like it and say there should never be animals that are controlled lethally, or you think that that is the only method to use. You know, the how can be distinguished much more easily on a scientific scale. The why is where the ethics come in. And we all have very different values and experiences, and that actually contributes to how we assess the why. But in order to do this, because it's happening all the time, wildlife control programs are going on, we need to create some type of framework and structure to actually look at these things objectively. And is there a decision-making point which we can say this project is reasonable and this project is not? And how do we get there using kind of an ethical framework was the goal of the work that I've been involved in. And so if you're really interested in this, this book also came out last year, and I'm happy to send the PDF around. It gets much more in depth about the ethical considerations for controlling wild animals, and I'll share that with the group if that's of interest. So what we did is, because I know a lot of really experts and smart people, and I was very fortunate to be able to call in some colleagues from around the world and bring them to UBC. One of them is here today, Greg is in our audience. And so we held a UBC forum that brought together academics, practitioners, nonprofit organizations, and even government staff from 7 different countries, including Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, South Africa, United Kingdom, US, and Canada, because all of these professionals are dealing with the same types of issues, just with different species. So they're either running or participating or, you know, asked to support or oppose wildlife control programs in their countries with certain species and inform those decisions. And so we all face many of the same challenges as to deciding whether there is an ethical and evidence-based way to navigate these decisions. So our goal, bringing everyone together, was to share our expertise and to understand kind of the global wildlife conflict situation, and then ultimately to define what is ethical wildlife control at the end of the day. Is that even a possibility of achieving? When we, at the end of the day, we were able to thankfully come together and come up with a set of principles, and we published that. So there's over 20, there's I think exactly 20 authors in the publication, and again I can share that publication with you in the future, and it is in conservation biology, and I'm really grateful to my co-authors for moving this paper forward, because we really needed something out there that could be accessible to managers, to Parks Canada, to others, to help them navigate these really tough decisions. Publication is lovely, and having it open access is important, because then everybody can get a hold of it. But at the end of the day, we really wanted to kind of pare it down into a format that we can just talk about it with anyone. And if anyone asks me, you know, is this reasonable? Like, is this ethical to go ahead with this type of practice? We can go through this framework every time and be consistent. And so this is an infographic. Again, it's available on our website, and it just is 7 principles for ethical wildlife control. And I'm going to walk through each of these actually with an example of how we use this as a tool to evaluate 2 different projects that came to our attention at the BC SPCA. So the first project, and if you're from Victoria, you may be familiar with a deer cull that was proposed and actually went ahead in 2011, 2012 maybe. And so this was a municipal initiative. It was decided upon by mayor and council. They applied and received a provincial permit. It was to cull black-tailed deer in the municipality. Of course, Oak Bay is, you know, surrounded by Saanich and Victoria, so it's not its own island, even though they might want to be. So these are native species, and there is no hunting in this area that is currently permitted. There was an increase of deer car accidents, and that's really where some of the media attention was on, some of the resident concern. Of course, this is always an issue on our provincial roads, but overall it was a lot of nuisance complaints that were driving the issue. So deer eating people's beloved roses. In Guayhanas, the deer eradication program was a Parks Canada initiative, of course, in partnership with co-managed by the Haida Nation. This involved Sitka deer. These are an introduced species on the islands, and these are hunted populations. And the main impetus for this program proposal was, of course, ecosystem damage. And so we're going to walk through both of these examples through each of the kind of principles to see how they applied and how we came to our decision as the BC SPCA. So our colleague in Brazil really told us about the challenges they had with marmosets, that they were raiding people's homes and they were coming into windows and vehicles. And of course, we've seen this with other species like bears in bear country of British Columbia, but it was a result of feeding. And so our very first step, and we debated this a long time, was to like the importance of this particular step to address in the management before you even can say whether control project's going forward or not, is you have to begin by modifying human practices. So if there are feeding events, you know, really, you're never going to solve the problem with control if this continues to happen. And so long-term education and prevention was step 1 for evaluating any of these projects. And when we look at the difference between the two, of course, in Oak Bay, that was an issue. Oh, sorry. That was a significant issue. So the deer were not only intentionally being fed by some residents, but there was a lot of unintentional access, you know, to very delicious garden plants that wasn't being prevented with any type of fencing. And so these deer were not going to, even if you removed that group of deer, other deer are going to continue to come back. On Guayhanas, of course, there wasn't an issue of feeding. In fact, the deer themselves, I've never seen deer eat seaweed before. You know, the deer probably struggled to find food themselves. So the human intervention piece, of course, with such a remote setting was not a factor. The second step was about justifying any control program with evidence. And we actually used our North American example of urban deer because it was such a hot topic at the time when we met in 2015. There had been not only the cull in Oak Bay, but there was Kimberley and Cranbrook and Invermere and just all these other areas that was a really, really controversial culls. And this was happening across the US as well. In terms of justifying a control program with evidence, there really needed to be a goal. What is the goal of the program? Can you monitor your progress towards that goal was the key thing. And in some cases, it was really just like, you know, the animals are a nuisance. It wasn't so much that the damage was so significant that it was affecting people or property or livelihoods, but it was really, when you looked down at it, it was just, you know, complaints about nuisance behavior. In Oak Bay, there was a serious issue, of course, with the vehicles, but this is where looking at the data actually really mattered, because all of these data points that you see where were hit, if you're familiar with this area, there's a golf course right there. And so the deer were just coming off the golf course on a road that actually had quite a high speed, and there was really no clearance for people to see the animals coming on and off. And so that's really a solvable issue. Rather than removing all the deer, you can actually solve this problem by looking at this. Whereas when I was in Guyana, so of course I'd never heard the term moss desert before, and this is a completely different problem. And the goal, of course, to restore the forest could be monitored over time. So this was something that was very clearly different when we looked at the data of the projects. The third point was exactly this, is measuring the long-term objective outcomes of the programs. And so when you have something that's very clearly undefined as to what you're going to achieve, of course, the public support isn't going to really be there. And so this is in the UK, the example our colleagues had was that, you know, TB is quite a problematic, of course, for cattle, and they wanted to remove and cull all of the badgers in their areas to prevent the spread of TB. And in fact, pilot projects had been done, and it did not actually reduce TB prevalence, it actually increased it, because the animals that were left over tended to move around more. So again, considering how programs are operated in the long-term goals of these programs, you know, just removing all of the animals doesn't always fix the problem at the end of the day. In Oak Bay, this example can be demonstrated by the fact that Oak Bay has deer that come and go from Saanich and from Victoria. There was no defined population. They actually couldn't put a number on the population of deer in Oak Bay. So to be able to say we want to remove 10% or 50% or 100% of these animals, they didn't even know how many animals that would be. And so that was, you know, of course, a real red flag for this project. Whereas for Guyanas, there was an end goal. They could actually see what success would look like if control was, whether through exclusion or other means, was enabled. And of course, for the BC SPCA, this was kind of one of our top priorities, but it fell to number 4 because the reality is you wouldn't even get to this point of considering a control project and considering what we need to do to ensure animal welfare if it didn't meet the first 3. So animal welfare priorities mean that you are clearly identifying your methodology, who's trained to do what. Non-lethal methods can, of course, be used in some of these control programs for exclusion and relocation, but there is some research that shows sometimes when you translocate animals, that's actually worse outcomes for welfare for these animals, not only through the capture and translocation process, but actually their outcome at the end of the day. So there has to be the method that causes the least harm to those individual animals. You know, a lot of people who are wildlife biologists talk about populations, and it's the population health at the end of the day that's important. From a wildlife welfare perspective, each individual animal has to be considered as to their welfare, because it just doesn't justify it to say, well, the harms to the group are minimal, but the harms to some individual animals are significant. So our colleagues in New Zealand, you know, use this example of the possums, which are unfortunately enemy number 1 in New Zealand. And the methods that were being used to kill possums in New Zealand are pretty horrific. And so if control is acceptable in New Zealand, they still have to prioritize animal welfare no matter what the species is. In Oak Bay, the example here is that the clover traps, they were used a system where they collapsed on top of the deer and then captive bolt is utilized versus sharpshooting and kind of sweeping teams that were used in Guyanas. And so there are 2 different methodologies. And there had definitely been quite a bit of concern about the clover traps because they had animals that were injured in those process before they actually were killed, or they were trapped for quite a period of time before anyone responded. So those were flagged as concerns. Number 5, the principle was to maintain social acceptability. So really including community values to the decision making. I think that's why we're all here today. So that yes, there's science that needs to inform how to conduct a program, but at the end of the day, it needs to have social license to actually proceed. And so having a community-led effort is really important. And I think it's much more successful in the long term because it's not going to be thwarted by different opinions. And we saw that with the deer in some of the communities that had culls that were vandalized, their traps and everything. But our colleagues in Australia actually told us about the example where foxes were raiding this island with endangered penguins in Middle Island, and the foxes were being culled, but then of course the foxes kept coming back, the other population. So it was just a sink that continued. And unfortunately, you know, it wasn't very acceptable. This was a very tourist attractive area that the community wanted to be really proud of how they managed these animals. At the end of the day, they actually got guard dogs. So guardian dogs were much more effective at actually scaring off the foxes, and the penguins population, you know, was safe. So again, that was the solution for a control program that was acceptable to that community. In Oak Bay, it was very controversial. If you were around at that time in the area, there was a lot of press and media. There were people out trying to find the traps, where they were located. You know, the mayor, you know, put his re-election stake on this particular issue. It was not well received by many members of the community. Whereas, and there was very little consultation, I have to mention that as well. And so, whereas, of course, we have the project in Guayhanas went through a lot of public consultation before it went forward. Conducting systematic planning. So this means you got to really think of the long-term management. So it's not one and done. You know, you just can't do a control program and walk away from it, because that doesn't work. We know that. And so, in this case, our colleagues in South Africa, you know, really went over the situation with the elephants being overpopulated in particular areas as a result of habitat loss and the culling of elephants, which is hard to imagine, but was part of the control programs by the government. And unfortunately, it was problematic, you know, of course, not only from a social point of view, but it didn't actually work to what they were trying to achieve at the end of the day. And so I just think that this is a particularly challenging example to demonstrate that, you know, there wasn't a long-term financial investment. This wasn't going to be continued. The elephant population was just going to come back, and you're going to have to keep doing this every couple of years. And so that is not an appropriate way to make a decision to support a control program when it doesn't have the long-term planning. In Oak Bay, there's lots of jokes running around about, you know, how is this going to, you know, turn out year to year? Can we just do a cull 1 year and solve all of our problems? It's quite the fodder for the cartoonist in the local paper, but there really was no plan. You know, there wasn't an identified how many deer was going to be removed from the community each year, how they were going to prevent deer from coming back into the community. It was, you know, really just kind of a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. In Haida Gwaii, there were biozones that were identified, and once animals were removed from islands that were determined to be, the goal was deer-free island, they would actually have locals, you know, continue to maintain that program for the years to come. So very different situations. And finally, something we debated a lot between the members of our working group was really about how animals with labels are really considered when it comes to control programs, because often as soon as you call an animal a pest, or you say it's overabundant, it's introduced, it's not native, whatever label you give it, that often justifies some type of action. And in our mind, that's not appropriate. There are reasons for control that we've talked about already, but you just can't throw a negative label and go ahead with a control program that is not going to meet the principles just because this animal has some type of a negative label associated with it. So it was really about making decisions that are based on specifics of the situation, not labels. And in this case, of course, the gray wolf, which we know has been identified to need to be removed, apparently by some government officials in different provinces as well as different states. You know, they give the wolf a particularly negative kind of terminology depending on where you're from. We also see this with some bird species, right? So we see birds that are labeled as pests, but you know, control programs to remove them may not actually be effective just because you want to continue, they're going to continually come back as well. So that was an important step in kind of asking ourselves, how do we make decisions about whether a control program is ethical? And it would not be ethical if you're doing it just for the sake of this animal that is disliked, basically. So in Oak Bay, of course, they were seen as a pest by some people in the community, even though they were a native species that had been there for a long time, whereas the animals on the islands were actually, people didn't want to get rid of all of them. They actually want to hunt them. There's cultural use and purposes, of course, for these animals. And so it wasn't like we're getting rid of them because we don't like them. There was a much different ecological basis for that decision. When it came down to it, of course, the Oak Bay Deer Cull did not meet our ethical review. When we were going through the principles, most of them could not be met. Since that time, of course, the citizen science group, the Urban Wildlife Stewardship Society, has led many different studies and an immunocontraception program in Oak Bay, which is really exciting to kind of see and watch over time. And that's really reduced the tension in the community, I think. People want something to be done to ensure that the problems, the car accidents and some of the nuisance, or even people's personal safety, if they didn't feel like a deer was going to stalk them on the street type thing, that this is being addressed. It is important, but at the end of the day, there was no justification ethically to actually control them through a lethal means. In Guayahanas, the eradication program actually met all of the principles for ethical wildlife control, and that's really the first time that we've reviewed a program that has been so extensive that has kind of gone through all of those principles. We did not oppose the eradication program. In this case, we did not support it. I'll say that is a different actual position. So we would only support an eradication program when it benefits the actual animals. So if they're suffering from disease or some other condition, that's when we would actually say, like, these animals need help more than, that we wouldn't oppose a program. So I've gone through that quickly. I know there might be some questions, but I just want to acknowledge again all of my co-authors on this paper. I've tried to summarize it in 7 simple steps, but the reality, it took 2 full days of discussion and, probably I think a year and a half of the paper, and then another half a year to summarize them and get them out in a form that, again, I could just hand this over to wildlife managers and say, when they say, like, is our project, ethical, I can say, like, here are the questions you need to ask yourself to decide, if there's going to be a decision around support or a non-support of a particular program. So the Peter Wall Institute and Vancouver Foundation helped fund that working group and that meeting, and I want to just thank them. The principles themselves we use to guide our animal kind program, and so we developed an accreditation program for pest control companies. That's one of our real issues, is how people and professional commercial companies actually manage pests in our urban and rural areas through pest control. And it's a challenge that we've been trying to improve the welfare outcomes and reduce the suffering of pest animals. And so that's one of the main programs we work on now. And if you are interested in reaching out to me, here is my email address.
Okay, thank you so much, Sara. Much appreciated. Now I know Sara has to run for a meeting at 1, so we've still got probably about 15 minutes where we can go through questions, and then we'll make sure that you can leave with enough time to get where you need to be, Sara. So if anyone has any questions, you can either click the raise hand button or put them in the chat. And I see that Steve is first to the mark, so I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Stephanie, before we start, some people weren't here at the beginning, so I just remind you to really direct the question about the ethical framework and rendering decision, and reminding that we all have our own values and we do respect them, and we are not discussing that. But we are really interested in using Sara's expertise to help us out through this project and thinking what we think is important to us. So just a reminder to be kind.
All right, go ahead, Steve.
All right, thanks very much. I'll be very kind. Thanks, Sara. That was fantastic. Really appreciated it. And I love some of those points that you stressed there, particularly things like translocation not being a good solution in many cases, things that I've been advocating for many years myself. I've got your 7 ethical principles up on the back wall of my office, and I refer to them almost every day on the phone to people in the nature of my work. But I must admit that although I agree with about 98% of what is there, I struggle a lot with the last principle, number 7, about not using the labels. And I agree wholeheartedly with the idea of not using labels to justify control actions by themselves. But I think we use labels all the time in the other way to justify why we wouldn't be doing something when animals are native or endemic. And I think it's very important that we actually put the labels of hyperabundance and invasive on to make it very clear to people, and it links directly back to principle number 2 of justifying it with evidence. So if we've justified that a species is hyperabundant, I think it's then very important to attach that label to it to remind people that it's hyperabundant or that it's invasive, because if those measures to control that particular population or species are not taken, we won't ever deal with that root issue of the hyperabundance or the invasive challenge that we're facing. So I guess it's just a comment more than anything, but I think if I was one of your co-authors, I would have argued vociferously to be careful to include labels as part of this.
So we had this debate we had people with the same perspective as you did. And actually, it's important that labels, I guess, are understood to be the same amongst different groups, because some people assign labels to a species or a population that would not align with the definition of how someone else would define it. So, I define pigeons as being non-native throughout, but I wouldn't say they're invasive, necessarily in terms of damaging the environment or affecting another species. But if they had disease and they were, completely pushing out other native populations, then we would call them invasive, just like the bullfrog. So labels can be a factor, but you shouldn't, conduct a control measure just because they have a label. So we're not going to go out and remove all the pigeons, or because that would just be an impossible task for other reasons in the principles. But we felt that, a lot of the control programs that we were seeing at the time were just throwing out the label. So in Oak Bay, they just said the deer are hyperabundant in Oak Bay, but they had no benchmark to say that they were hyperabundant. And so they justified their call by saying we have an overpopulation of deer in Oak Bay. And in fact, that label was misused, but it just kind of carried over into the project. And they had one call session one year, and it was completely acceptable to the council at the time because the deer were hyperabundant. And so it was just a misuse of labels, I think, and to take it into context as to the appropriate justification for any label.
Oh, this group is starting to be shy. If no one asks, I am curious to know, like you have done this incredible workshop and produced the paper and now applied. Is there anything that you would like to add or like, I think now that you have used the framework a little bit, are you happy about it? Is something missing? Like, I am so curious about to hear how it's working for you.
So for us, when we've been asked to evaluate programs, it's been very useful. And I think that, if managers had to justify their control programs with some type of framework, this would be a good one to use to start, and if they had improvements upon it. But I think so many different control programs are just knee-jerk reactions to you know, public being upset, or to, you know, there's a lot of damage or danger or risk of these animals, and we saw that with all of the international experts that we had at the table, that in their countries, you know, someone would just say, let's go kill all the marmosets in this, you know, community because they're raiding people's homes. And same thing was happening in South Africa with baboons. And it was just like, whoa, the government is approving these massive control efforts, but at the same time, they weren't actually, you know, thinking through this, how, like, this isn't going to work. You're spending a lot of money and maybe calming, you know, public concern for a moment, but you're really not thinking this fully through. And these animals are going to suffer and die just because of this decision, which wasn't fair. You know, that it's about fairness, right? Are the animals, who gets to be kind of the voice for the animals at the decision-making table? Was really my goal personally, because I've seen so many decisions being made on management programs where that wasn't a factor. And they said, oh, well, we're doing it humanely, we're good. It was like, not just because you can kill the animal quickly without it suffering, does it mean it's okay to do this? So I think it's just really important that the animal gets a voice at the table. And this is the closest I could get to that with having these, you know, 7 steps that people have to kind of go through to really consider if their project is appropriate, I guess. Oh, I've been asked to put the 7 principles slide again. I do have the summary one, and again, it's in an infographic. I can send out the PDF as an infographic. I'm happy to do that in the future. So I'll just pull that up again. It's this one. Oh.
Please feel free either to raise your hand or type in a question, whatever you feel more comfortable with. And I always like to say too that you may not have the question right away. You still have to simmer all the great information we got. So if that's the case, don't worry, send us an email and we connect you with Sara for more chatting. So if you're shy or you don't have
no, I'm happy to speak to people, because we've used this framework. Like, I got an email this week about bullfrogs, you know, that you know, there's a lot of challenges with bullfrogs, of course, in watersheds. And so someone's asked us, you know, like, is it appropriate that, you know, we eradicate bullfrogs in this area, you know, versus is it appropriate that we eradicate, you know, gray squirrels in Victoria? You know, they've been there for a long time. You're probably not going to be successful at getting rid of them, but you can contain them. And maybe that's a better strategy rather than trying to justify control. So it's not just deer, it's not just wolves. You know, there are a lot of our urban species that a lot of people feel like they need to be managed in some way. But again, without, you know, kind of that knee-jerk reaction, we actually need to think through what is management and is it achievable, and you know, also considering all those factors around the label and welfare issues.
I've just prompted Lorna and Michael to unmute, so I think a little button or box or something should come up that you can click to unmute. There we go. You're unmuted.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this series, and I appreciate all the work you're putting into it. And I really enjoyed today's talk. In my real life, you know, I do a lot of palliative care and medically assisted in deaths. And we have objective and subjective guidelines and information that we can apply. I don't understand, I don't have that knowledge when it comes to wild animals. And I'm just wanting to get you maybe to talk about you know, what are the tools that you have at your disposal to actually be objective and subjective in knowing that you're doing humane death for a wild animal?
Okay, so at a big kind of umbrella level in terms of an ethical framework, so a lot of these types of projects are have to go through an ethical review from like a university or an institution. Parks Canada would have their own animal care committee. So you would have a variety of voices and expertise who actually make a decision as to, you know, have all the factors been kind of addressed, the concerns regarding the project. So there's animal ethics committees, similar to bioethics committees, when you're studying people. So there's that as a potential starting point, but not all projects have to go through that type of review. For example, so wildlife management practices that are conducted by governments don't always have to go through that type of review. When it comes to measuring animal welfare, you can actually measure, of course, stress. You can measure different types of behaviors that indicate stress. You can measure like cortisol. You can, there's both physiological and behavioral factors that you can study and recognize. But we also use something that's like time to death. As a measure of welfare. So how quickly did this particular action result in the animal's death? And then what happened during that time in terms of a scale of severity. So that has been a science that has been done in many different species, whether it's reptiles or birds or mammals. And so there is some guidance to determine what might be considered humane, but then different agencies kind of set their bar differently. So an industry like the farm animal industry, let's say, will set their bar as to like say it's acceptable for XYZ to happen, but then maybe a university says, well, if we're doing research with those same animals, our bar is higher for welfare and the time to death might need to be a lot shorter. Although you can measure it, at the end of the day, what it should be is still determined by the agency who says, this is, you know, the template we're going to be working with. And so we would love science to guide some of those rules, but it doesn't always. But there is thankfully a more and more growing body of people studying suffering in animals. And as you're familiar, of course, is that, you know, that there are worse things than death, unfortunately, for animals too. You know, animal suffering isn't always recognized as to the severity, but thankfully we're understanding more about animals, you know, how they kind of feel death, you know, and that experience of stress, whether it's just death from drowning. We understand more and more just through basic physiology about these animals as to what that experience must be like leading up until the point of death. Robin has a question.
Oh. Okay, it's prompted there.
I have asked a few questions, but on the chat line. But thank you, Sarah. I've hoped for this meeting for a couple of years, and it's great that you were finally able to do it. So I really appreciate that. I just have a few basic questions. I think Sidney Island is in a position where it's going to be extremely difficult for us to come up with a compromise. We're in a win-lose situation. Some people are going to win and some people are going to lose, and there seems to be no way for meeting of the minds. And I don't know if in that situation, whether you've had experiences with that kind of a situation, how we can get through that without coming out at the other end with a truly unpleasant situation, where those who may be opposed to eradication, you know, will feel that they're shut out, or feel that they need to go to the press, or that they need to go to court, or that they need to get involved in civil disobedience, who knows what. But we need a process where we can deal with the fact that we're in this dynamic, and I wonder if you had any experience with that.
Yeah, you know, I've seen situations where, as you said, decisions have been made and the community's not in agreement, and it has led to the civil disobedience. It has led to, you know, neighbors, no longer speaking to each other, and that's really unfortunate when it breaks down that fabric of the community. And these are not easy issues. And that's the challenge, is like there is not a right answer that's going to sit well with everyone. And unfortunately, I don't have, you know, kind of a magic solution, and I haven't quite seen a process that has ended up with everyone happy at the end of the day. The more that people get an opportunity to talk together, I think is important. You know, a lot of the other programs that I've seen go on, people don't get a voice at all. So ensuring that there is a voice, and ensuring that maybe that also there's consideration for a voice of those animals, you know, so is there another perspective that's not being included at the table, is something else to take it away from the personality and that personal difference of the values. But yeah, it's tough. You know, this is not going to be an easy answer.
I just, you know, the fallow deer are not represented in any way. Their views are not heard, obviously. But do you think that they should be morally considered?
Absolutely.
I mean,
yeah, you know, I think that all animals should be morally considered in this. You know, unfortunately, animals tend to lose when we consider them morally against humans. We see that in our day-to-day lives. But I think acknowledging that they, you know, have lives of meaning is important, and then how to appreciate and recognize that in a way that's respectful. You know, it is a challenge to navigate when you talk about a lethal program, for sure.
And one more question. That you talk about labeling and invasiveness, and I'm just wondering, you know, these animals, they are invasive, but they're invasive because humans brought them here. They didn't come here by themselves. They were brought by humans for human pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And it just is a gut reaction from me to say that to include to include invasiveness as a reason to kill these animals is pretty hypocritical when we brought them here.
And people would say that we are invasive as white people
well,
on the land. So
no kidding. The human being is the most invasive animal on the earth.
Yes.
So you know, I just one of the key points that Parks Canada keeps drilling at us is that they're invasive, and that's the reason why we should get rid of them. Well, I don't buy that argument. But anyway, thank you for coming, and it was. I wish we had another hour with you. I really do.
Well, thank you, Robin.
Maybe we can get another hour with you at some point.
Well, thank you for being a champion.
And Robin, what we, Stephanie and I have tried to do is like really bringing these experts to the community to discuss important theme. And if you want to hear more from Sara, maybe we can pester her a lot and she can come back. So there might be, or there might be also other.
Pester away, please, pester away.
But I can't come back with the answer. That's the thing is.
No, I know. I'm not asking for an answer. I'm asking for ideas and concepts, and
that's what
I just feel that you know, these animals have not been properly represented, and we have a large, very big Goliath type organization, Parks Canada, who have pushed and pushed and pushed, and it's been a real struggle to put forward any other ideas.
Okay, I see one more question in the chat, but I'm mindful of the fact that Sara has to go. The question was if you had any experience or advice on the ethics of hunting in perpetuity versus eradication. But if you don't have time to answer that right now, we could always circle back and connect with Susan and Vic via email if you have to run.
I'm happy to answer that, but it might lead to an answer that you're not quite expecting. So of course, there's different reasons for hunting. Of course, if it's for cultural and ceremonial purposes versus sport hunting, you know, commercial hunting, you know, these animals used to be farmed. I appreciate that. But if you look at it from a pure, the ongoing process of hunting animals and removing a couple hundred deer a year from the island, over 10 years, that actually turns out to be a lot more deer that are killed at the end of the day than an eradication program that immediately removes the animals. So I'm not saying I'm for or against either, but I'm just saying from a pure animal number in terms of the animals that are actually killed at the end of the day over a long period of time, it does, you know, perpetuate the killing of animals year over year over year and generations. So that's just the black and white of it.
So we have 5 minutes left, and I don't want, Sara, for you to be short on your time. We may say bye to Sara so that she can prepare for her next meeting, but me and Stephanie will be here with you. And you're thinking, Yerman, who again? Yes, we'll be here with you, and we can still keep the floor open for a discussion in between people in the room. But
and I'll leave with one thing to consider, because I don't know this, but on Sidney Island, I guess, and one of the things that was discussed in other projects is what other animals are impacted. So we talked a lot about deer, but I would love to know what is the goal for the outcome of other animals on the island. So if we look at the welfare of the birds or welfare of other species, how does that dynamic play with the you know, your program? So that's just something, a factor to discuss and consider perhaps in the future, because I think that yes, it's important to focus on these particular animals that are the focal point of the control program, but are there other species of wildlife that will, you know, be involved in this as well? I think it just is an overall consideration.
And I think with that, Sara, you have created the next framework which has the 8 point, which is like, how does it impact the rest of the ecosystem, which will be a great addition to add. Thank you so much. And I'm really grateful. And I would like to say thank you from all this group for coming and chatting with us. I am honestly will pester you just because I am so curious to talk more, but it's mostly you come really close to my study area, so I'm like,
you guys are navigating a really tough situation. I don't envy any of you in making you know, recommendations going forward. It is very difficult, and I appreciate that you're open to hearing from different perspectives.